Ladies and gentlemen, just before we begin, I'd like to share a little housekeeping announcement. Kindly do pay attention. First up, mobile phones. Kindly switch your handphones or mobile phones to the silent mode. Valuables, please do keep and take extra special care of your personal belongings. Translation devices. The simultaneous interpretation system, better known as SIS. Well, these are the channels. English to Bahasa Indonesia is on channel 1. English to Japanese on channel 2. English to Thai, channel 3. BI or Thai to English, channel 4. Well, collection of the receivers is at the back of the hall, and you will be required to present a photo identification for collection. Up next, questions and answers. By now, you should be familiar with the Q&A modus operandi, so kindly address all questions via the RSPO RT17 event app. To facilitate all questions and answers sessions, dedicated internet connectivity has been made available in this ballroom. Kindly connect to RT17 network, and the password will be RSPO, all in lowercase. We appreciate it very much if you can restrict the usage of this service to the question and answer sessions. Next, the presentation download. Presentations will be uploaded to the RT17 website at the end of each conference day. All you have to do is go to rt.rspo.org. On the landing page, just click on the RT17 main tab. Click RT17 Presentations located below the program subtitle. Next, the GA registration. Deadline for the GA16 registration is at 11 a.m. today, so kindly approach the registration counter for assistance. Next up, name badge return post-conference. We'd also like to encourage all delegates to return your name badges and lanyards to the organizer at the end of the conference if you do not have a use for it post-conference. Collection boxes are located outside this ballroom and at the end at the registration counter. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, a special announcement, Lufthansa. Well, travel via Lufthansa may be impacted due to the industrial action on the 7th and 8th of November. So delegates, you're advised to check with the status of your flights prior to departures. And well, ladies and gentlemen, I believe you're all aware of the housekeeping announcement. And right now, we'd like to begin our day. First and foremost, we'd like to wish you a very good morning and welcome back to the conference Day 2 RT17. We shall begin with the plenary session 4, using evidence to drive change. May I now invite our panel of speakers on stage to take the seats. First up, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Yannick Schmidt, Chief Executive Officer, 2.0 LCA Consultants. Next, we'd like to invite Dr. Sarah Lake, Managing Director of Supply Chains, Climate Advisors. Dr. Matthew Strubig, Reader in Conservation Science, Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology, University of Kent. And to moderate this session, may I call upon Ms. Vidya Rangan, Senior Manager, Impacts and Evidence, ISEAL Alliance. I shall now hand over the session to Ms. Vidya.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. The last time I was at a session at an RT, also in Bangkok 3 years back, there was a session on impacts and the theory of change. And the audience was a little less than we have in the room here today, but that was because the US election had been called at that time on that day. So for those of you who are RT regulars, you all will remember that. But I do hope we have more participation and more engagement in today's session. Just to kick us off and set the scene, for those of us who work in this field, the question of impacts is one that keeps recurring. And I think for us at ISEAL, the focus on impacts has been pretty central to our work and the work we do with our members. But I think more generally in the sustainable field today, the focus on impacts is on two very important questions. The first is Is your scheme capable of demonstrating sustainability impact? Are you able to show that you are making changes on the sustainability issues and outcomes that you say you will? But the second is a more important one. There's an increasing focus on the business case. Is there a business case for companies, for smallholders, for intermediary supply chain partners to be investing in certification, to be investing in any sustainability tool or approach? So I think those two questions, the evidence on the impacts case and the evidence on the business case, is really becoming quite central. And I think a further challenge that we have is today we know that certification and standards are one of many tools that are out there for companies and governments to help achieve their goals. And so the question is, yes, does your scheme have impacts, but how does it contrast with other approaches out there as well? So to help us navigate these questions, we have a lineup of 3 very interesting presentations, which to me, I think touch upon the impacts case and the business case quite nicely. So the way we plan to run the session is have each presenter share their research findings, and then have a couple of questions that I can pose to them after that. And then, of course, at the end of all 3 presentations, to take questions from the floor as well. So please do get into the app and start posing your questions there right from the start. So with that introduction, I think I'll kick us off and invite Yannick to first come up and share his research findings.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to see you here. I will now give my presentation on a very recent study we have been finalizing. It's a comparative life cycle assessment of RSPO certified versus non-certified palm oil. So, just to give you a little bit of background, when you are talking about sustainable palm oil, if you want to do something sustainable, certification is the most acknowledged choice. That's what we got. But the big question here is, what is the benefit? Until very recently, you didn't know. How much greenhouse gas emissions were you saving if you were committing to buy certified oil? No one knew. How much biodiversity could you save? Biodiversity impact could you save? No one knew. So these questions, they were becoming more and more pressing. So back in 2016, exactly almost the same place here in Bangkok, for exactly 3 years ago, we launched this crowdfunded project. There was in total 16 companies funding this study. You see their logos on the slide here. The study was finalized just 2 months ago. So, what did we do? We are using life cycle assessment. Some of you might be familiar with life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is where you are taking into account all the emissions and resource inputs from cradle to grave. Here you see cultivation, the palm oil mill, and the refinery. So all these stages in the life cycle are taken into account. Of course, we also take into account the crushing of the kernels, which are produced into kernel oil and kernel meal. And not only that, that is what we call the foreground system here. That's where we collect very detailed data. We also take into account what we call the background system. So here we are using databases to account for the production of the fuels we are using, the production of the fertilizers, also land use changes. I'll come back to that a little bit. We also take into account HCV, nature conservation areas set aside within the land bank of the producers that provide some benefits as well. So we take the full life cycle of palm oil into account. So now I give a few words on the methods and the goal and scope of the study. First of all the results I will be presenting in a few minutes, they refer to 1 kilogram of refined palm oil. The scope of this study here is that the results, they refer to a base year of 2016, and we are referring to the average of Indonesia and Malaysia, so palm oil production in Indonesia and Malaysia. We include land use changes as well as nature conservation, as I mentioned just before. The study is conducted using 2 different methods, so you cannot come and claim that we are not using the right methods, because we're using all the different methods and we compare the results. Besides that, we are also using some very detailed models in the LCA framework. We are dealing with very detailed nitrogen balances on the estate level. We're having a state-of-art peat emission modeling. We establish palm oil mill boiler energy balances and detailed stack emissions calculations. And further, we are using state-of-art palm oil mill effluent treatment models for quantifying methane emissions and also mitigation of methane emissions. So, no results without data. So we did a lot of data collection. We are comparing certified and non-certified. Then one big question could be, how did we get data on non-certified? Because that's not really where you can find a lot of data. So our approach here is that we have very good data for the total industry. We have statistical data, etc. We also have very good data for RSPO certified producers. We have all the assessment reports which are publicly available. So if you take the total industry minus all the certified producers, then you have the non-certified producers as the residual. So that was the approach. The total industry, here we have been using international national statistics, GIS mapping for different soil types, land use changes. We use different LCA data to close the gaps. For the RSPO certified producers, we have using the RSPO assessment report, and we collected primary data here from 634 estates and 165 oil mills. That altogether account for 58% of the total certified fresh fruit bunches and crude palm oil. So, what did all these data show then? First of all, the estates. I've just put a screen dump from the key performance indicators here. What you should focus on here is not, of course not all the numbers, but if we take the second row here, we saw that the share of oil palm on peat was significantly higher, or it was lower for certified and higher for non-certified. You could also see, if you take the next row, the drainage depth, so the water management of the peat. Here we saw a higher water table of certified compared to non-certified, where there was a deeper drainage. We also saw differences in yields. There were higher yields for the certified, and then in the end we also saw higher fertilizer use in the certified estates due to better fertilizer practices. Looking at the oil mills, what we observed here was higher oil extraction rates for the certified producer, slightly higher kernel extraction rates. We have a significantly higher share of POMI treatment with biogas capture. And we also saw that certified producers, they had nature conservation set aside, 3% of the land bank on average. So we saw some significant differences in practices. Then the big question is, all these data, and when we calculate the results, where does it take us? First of all, we saw that greenhouse gas emissions, they were 36% lower for certified oil, which is quite a high difference. Secondly, looking at the biodiversity impact, we saw that there was a 20% lower impact for RSPO certified palm oil. That is partly due to higher yields, but also due to nature conservation set aside. And on the other hand, we saw slightly higher impacts for respiratory inorganics. That refers to particulate emissions and ammonia emissions, and that relates to this slightly higher fertilizer consumption in the certified estates. Okay, but what are then the explanations of these differences? So here I must say that the devil lies in the detail. We have to dive deep into the data and the results to explain these differences. So here I've provided a breakdown of results. The middle column here shows the results of the certified, and the right column the non-certified. If you go to the very bottom of this table here, you see exactly the same greenhouse gas results as you saw on the previous slide. So there is this 36% difference here. So where do we then find the explanation of the difference between the two? Firstly, we have a low peat share and a low drainage depth for certified palm oil. That explains quite some of the difference. Secondly, we saw some lower impacts for certified because of the higher yields. Next, we saw, on the contrary, slightly higher impacts for certified because of the higher fertilizer consumption. And then finally, one of the other bigger differences is due to more biogas capture for certified palm oil. So these are the main explanations of differences in results here. Okay, then going a bit more into detail, what matters? And here we have identified peat as a main contributor. Another one is POMI treatment, that would be the next slide, and then finally nature conservation. So what we see here, that's all on cultivated peat soils. What you see in the background, that's good water management for a RSPO certified grower. And what we see here in the foreground of the picture is poor water management for a non-certified grower. So you see, for these two, it's a very specific and very visual, clear example of differences in water management. So where do the emissions then come from? Peat, it's organic soil with high carbon content. If you're not cultivating peat, it is generally waterlogged, so all the carbon will stay in the soil. Then, if you want to cultivate, you will typically drain so that you can manage, or you can do the work there. But when you are draining the peat, oxygen will enter the peat, and it will start decaying, emitting CO2. So that's where we have the emissions from. And then, just looking at the water management issue here, that is, if you have 1 hectare of peat cultivated, for the average, 1 hectare will give you slightly above 40 tons of CO2. But for 1 hectare of certified with a higher or a not so deep drainage depth will give you only 32 tons of CO2. So water management matters. Moving on to POMI treatment, or biogas capture. Around 1/3 of all the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from palm oil production comes from POMI treatment, where you have methane emissions from anaerobic ponds. This can be more than eliminated, these emissions, by biogas capture. What you see here is a picture of biogas capture tanks, and if you look carefully, you will see a yellow pipe coming out of one of the tanks. If we follow this yellow pipe, it goes all the way into a power production unit, a gas motor that produces electricity. The electricity is sold to the grid, where it offsets coal-based electricity in Malaysia and Indonesia. So therefore, we can more than eliminate the impact. Moving on to nature conservation. How can we calculate the impacts of nature conservation? First of all, nature conservation, it will give us a net saving, meaning that we are mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a local saving. We are avoiding deforestation locally in the land bank, but we have a remote impact. How come that? Well, the local saving is more or less logical to everyone. We are avoiding local deforestation or transformation of forest to oil palm. So that gives us a benefit. But we also have a remote impact, and that is because if you set aside oil palm in the land bank, users of palm oil, they will not reduce the consumption. Consumption will stay stable. So that means setting aside land for nature conservation means that oil palm production needs to take place somewhere else. So we are then here, that means that if you have a very low carbon stock, nature conservation is not really contributing to anything good. But if you are setting aside high carbon stock and high conservation value, it contributes a lot. So on average, our results show that if you have 1 hectare of nature conservation, that would mitigate around 1 ton of CO2 equivalents every year. But if you could manage to set aside peat soil, then you would save 33 to 42 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. So conservation of peat at least when you are talking about greenhouse gas emissions, counts a lot more. Now, moving to the conclusions. First of all, we have a state-of-art model. It is capable of, currently we are dealing with more than 600 estates and more than 150 oil mills. We are calculating results in 2 different modeling assumptions. And our results, they show that certified, RSPO certified palm oil is performing significantly better than non-certified. So it gives us a 36% lower greenhouse gas emission impact, 20% lower nature occupation. So what we see here is really that life cycle assessment guides what matters. Which impacts are the most important? Where in the life cycle of the palm oil system can we have the largest improvement options? And what can be done to improve further? Looking further, then what can we then use these results for? First of all, we can measure the impact of certification. Now it's not only a matter of complying with criteria. Now it's a matter of reduction in real impacts. Looking at palm oil using companies, many companies, they are committing to use 100% certified palm oil. I just saw the brochure of BASF outside the booth, and in the first page, they're using exactly these results here to show how much greenhouse gas emissions are they mitigating every year because they are committing to use RSPO certified palm oil. So that's what you can use the data for if you are using palm oil. On the supply side, if you're looking at the palm oil industry, they can now document that there is a more sustainable way of producing palm oil and document it in real numbers on greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, etc. The results here, they can also be used as inputs for the next criteria revision for certification because the LCA guides what matters. Further, my recommendation to the RSPO is instead of only having targets for the uptake and amount of CPO certified and on the criteria, now RSPO can also set targets for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity impacts. Finally, the next question is, of course, what is next? So, as we did exactly 3 years ago, where we launched this project here, we are today launching the next project. Because certification is not something static. We calculated results for 2016. We calculated average results for only Malaysia, Indonesia, and we included all growers altogether. So, of course, since certification is not static, it's relevant to look over time, to follow the impact. Is RSPO certification able to further improve? Can we reduce the impact per kilogram of palm oil in the future? And how is the development? How is the further installation of palm oil mill effluent treatment with biogas capture? Can we have more nature conservation? Can we have better water management of peat? And can we reduce the share of cultivated peat? All these questions is what we try to answer in this new crowdfunded project. So if you want to join this project, you can contribute by shaping the scope and get early access to all data. Obviously, in the very end of the project, when it's finalized, everything will be made publicly available, as we do of the current finalized study. You will find this brochure, as you see here, in some of the booths outside. And you can also visit our website if you are interested in more information. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And questions are the most welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Yannick. Maybe a couple of questions from me before we move to the next presentation. So the LCA is a very specific methodology. And your first attempt at sort of applying this to RSPO, what value do you see in RSPO using this across the entire system. So is it possible to actually scale up the use of this approach?
That's a very good question. And I agree with you that the common perception of LCA is that you do a study of a very small thing, or maybe individual companies or individual production units. But that the tool and the framework is not limited as such. Many of the studies we're doing it at the global scale. We have LCA of the global food consumption as one example. We also do national footprinting, so we do national waste footprints, national carbon footprints, per capita emissions. So you can do at the global, at a national scale. We also do studies at the EU level, so regional is also an option. And further, we are also zooming in on specific sectors in some cases. So one example here is, of course, the palm oil sector, but we've also been doing in the construction sectors, the plastic converter sectors, the dairy sector. And then, of course, you can zoom down to very, very small things if you also like that. So there's no limitation in that sense.
That's encouraging. So I think everyone is looking forward to the phase 2 of your research. Maybe one last question. You mentioned the use of the method both on estates and smallholder operations. Do you see any particular challenges with using a methodology such as LC at smallholders? And I ask this because you are requiring a lot of data and a lot of very specific data to fuel the tool. And the smallholder profile within RSPO is increasing. So do you have any tips on applying this to the smallholder setup?
I would say, theoretically speaking, there's no limitations of applying it to smallholders. There's absolutely no difference. But the challenge is data collection. When you're dealing with smallholders, you're dealing with smaller units, and it's obvious that the data management for smaller units is not in the same order as for large units. So there's definitely a data collection issue, but I would say that's the only limitation.
Right. Thank you, Yannick. And now I'd like to invite Sarah for her presentation. Sarah?
Thank you, Vidya. So I'm going to speak more on the business case side of impacts. So as Vidya mentioned, we are covering environmental impacts, but also looking at the business side in terms of if sustainability pays. And what we wanted to look at Climate Advisors was that we know there's lots of research to suggest that there's business case models, that there is an incentive for doing sustainability, but does this actually play out in the market? Are companies seeing higher profits based on sustainability behavior? So what we wanted to do is look specifically at the RSPO and ask, are RSPO companies performing better financially than the non-RSPO peers? And this is a really important question given that companies increasingly don't see price premiums for sustainable palm oil. They're not seeing the profits despite the fact that there's significant investments into their supply chains. So we wanted to ask this question to explore, are there financial returns for these companies over the long term to suggest that their sustainability commitments pay off, and in particular, their RSPO membership has financial returns and encourages greater returns over time. So we asked this research question and undertook a study that looked at the company's performance over a period of 2012 to 2019. How we did this is we examined over 90 companies to look at their financial performance over that 7-year period and performed a back test to see if there was statistically significant difference in their performance. We then identified that there is a difference in their performance, but how different is their performance? So we whittled down to a subset of RSPO companies. We looked at companies based on their criteria of the structure of the company and their investability. So in particular, the companies had to operate primarily in agriculture, have over 20% of their value from palm oil, have a market cap over $25 million, and have at least 10% of their stocks available for investment to suggest some fluidity in their investability. So with this, we identified 18 RSPO palm oil companies and looked at their performance over time. These are the companies that ended up in the index. And as the companies shifted in their performance, some drop in and drop out based on if their market cap drops or there's a lack of fluidity in their stock availability. But what we wanted to do is say, okay, let's create an index and monitor these companies. It's relatively simple. This is far less complex than what you just saw in terms of a life cycle assessment. Just simply looking at how they perform and what their equity returns are over time. And our findings were remarkable and very encouraging. So we found that the RSPO companies we looked at outperformed the non-RSPO peers by over 24%, so nearly 25% better in terms of their equity returns in that 7-year period. Mind you, we're looking just at producers. So these are just producers, they're public companies, and they are on the larger side. However, we can see a really distinct premium for these companies based on their RSPO membership. We also looked at the average performance. So here in this chart, the green line indicates the RSPO companies, the orange are the non-RSPO companies, and the gray is the average. So even compared to the average company, the RSPO companies were outperforming by nearly 5% on their premiums. This is incredibly encouraging, that there is indeed a profit incentive for being an RSPO member. If we look into this even further, we can see some really important moments in time where there's an uptick in terms of the premium that the RSPO members are receiving. So in particular, we see earlier in the index, there's not too much of a difference between the RSPO companies and the non-members. But as company commitments emerge, and there's a distinction over companies that are publicly committing to sustainability, that difference continues to increase a little bit. We then have, in 2015, a major suspension by the RSPO, and we see a significant rise in the premium immediately following this. This suggests that as the RSPO is seen to be credible, to have teeth behind its principles and criteria, that the premium continues to rise for these companies. And similarly, as the principles and criteria were revised in the last year or so, we see an indication that this premium continues to rise over time, suggesting that there is a long-term increase in the profitability of these RSPO companies. So we can look at the premium and the size of the premium over time to highlight this even further. So what we see is that the size of the premium for the RSPO companies increases by over 300% in the 7-year period. This is, again, very encouraging. The premium continues to grow so that the RSPO companies are receiving higher equity returns. Again, this is for producing companies and for larger companies, but does suggest that the RSPO membership is meaningful in terms of the financial performance of these companies. However, we also wanted to look at how these companies fare when there are problems in their supply chains, when there are known violations, or there's attention drawn to a lack of due diligence. And we find that there's significant material losses for these companies. We've seen RSPO producing companies have over $5 million of restoration liabilities, other companies that have lost over $14 million in their profits based on violations and their suspension, and other companies where there's an 8% drop in revenue, their share price drops significantly, and all because of the violations of the RSPO principles and criteria. So what this suggests is that the RSPO companies are held to a higher standard. They are in the spotlight simply by being RSPO members. So there is indeed a premium for them. However, there is greater attention to their behavior and therefore significant financial consequences. But then we wanted to ask, well, does this apply to the non-RSPO companies? We know there are companies that are non-RSPO members that aren't in the spotlight simply because they have opted out of sustainability systems. So does that mean that they get away with more? Their practices are often more egregious. They have known deforestation issues, labor rights issues, land rights issues, but do they also suffer these financial losses as we're seeing? So what we did is we looked at the 5 5 of the largest non-RSPO companies. And these are the 5 that we chose based on their comparability to our index. So they're publicly listed companies, they operate largely in palm oil, and they have fluidity in their stock holdings. And so we asked a couple of key questions of these companies. We asked, first of all, do they have issues in their supply chain? Which I think is not going to be a surprise for most people to hear. We asked how these companies are performing financially over time. And we asked sort of who else is connected to these companies to understand the broader context of their production. So what we found is, to no surprise, these companies had significant violations of NDPE practices. They had planning on peatlands, they had child labor, they had clearance of biodiversity habitats. None of this is too surprising. This has been revealed in various reports, in various advocacy campaigns. So we cataloged this and said, yes, all of these companies have these incidences. And then we looked at how they performed financially. We expected that they would have some financial woes. Our index suggests they would perform less well than their RSPO peers. And indeed, we see these companies taking significant hits immediately following sustainability violations, with stock prices dropping over years' time to half of what they were, to revenues dropping, and their market value dropping overall. So this confirmed the findings of our index that non-RSPO companies would not perform as well. But on a case-by-case basis, they also have significant financial penalties for their violations. None of this is probably a surprise to any of you at this point. This is what we would expect. We'd expect these companies to have some problems and to have some financial losses. But what we found that was surprising was that these companies were all connected to RSPO members in some way. The companies either were indirect suppliers to RSPO companies, they had shares in RSPO companies, or RSPO companies held shares in them. Or they were receiving lending investment from financiers that were RSPO members. These ties were not on an individual basis, but actually several different connections among most of these companies to various RSPO members. I in no way mean to suggest that the RSPO members were aware of these violations by these 5 companies or complicit in them. We know that there's issues in assurance around indirect supply chains or around due diligence. And we know as well that the RSPO financing probably wasn't for palm oil specifically. These companies receive financing based on a number of different industries they're involved in. However, what I do mean to suggest is that the RSPO companies are exposed to significant risk as well as significant opportunities based on their links to these 5 non-RSPO members. First, we see that their risk is substantial because these companies are increasingly exposed in the media and in advocacy campaigns. An association with them will lead to the risk being tied to the RSPO members and the potential for financial losses. But second, and equally important, we see the opportunity for these RSPO members to be able to engage with these companies and to instill sustainability practices, either by suggesting them, providing resources, or even requiring them in order to be a part of their supply chain or part of their lending and investment. We see this especially with the finance sector. So all of these non-RSPO member companies are connected to major Western financiers. These are some of the largest financiers around the world that have lendings and investments in these 5 unsustainable companies. 3 of these are indeed RSPO companies, or RSPO financiers. They have practices in place and should be applauded for that. They have due diligence procedures, they have screening protocols, they have requirements that their clients have sustainability policies for that particular lending and investment. However, there still is room to improve. There's room for these financiers to make sustainability part of their lending criteria, regardless if their lendings are tied to palm oil. So how can we use this connection to the RSPO to actually highlight the opportunity rather than to simply place the RSPO member companies at risk of being associated with these unsustainable companies? So what do we make of all of this? So it's fantastic there is a premium. First of all, it's excellent that there's a premium for these RSPO member companies. They are receiving over 25% of an increased premium than their peers, who are non-members, and that's great. However, in order for these companies to continue to invest in sustainability, we like this premium to be even larger. How do we continue to grow this premium over time? Well, our suggestion is to make sure that RSPO membership remains meaningful. We see that the incidents within the RSPO where we see strengthening of principles and criteria, strengthening of assurance procedures, strengthening of the membership inclusion and exclusion policies, have financial implications, good implications for the member companies. So it's important for these companies who are receiving premiums now to receive bigger premiums, but that is contingent on the RSPO membership being meaningful, for there being continual improvement, and in particular for there being improvement in the assurances, so that as these violations happen, there are repercussions, companies will see financial losses, but overall that means the other member companies as well continue to perform financially better. So in conclusion, we see, yes, there is indeed not just a business case in theory, but a business case in practice. The RSPO membership, simply being a member, helps these companies financially perform. So we hope to continue to see this grow over time and continue to see the RSPO strengthen its identity, its principles and criteria, and its assurances. Thank you. I can sit down.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Very insightful and a lot of food for thought, I think, not just for work with RSPO members, but with the finance sector, I think. So just a couple of questions from me. At this stage, is your index capable of segregating how companies are performing at a regional basis or in terms of specific markets? What you've showed us is your analysis at a global level, but I think a lot of how the finance sector is moving, and I think campaigning with the investment sector is moving, is also regionally focused. So what next steps for your work with this index?
Yeah, unfortunately, the index does not distinguish among geography. The companies are listed on various stock exchanges around the world. So we cannot distinguish their performance based on their geography. We could do further research to look at where they're predominantly operating and see if there is a distinction there. However, currently, the sample size is small, where we're looking at 18 companies. So the more that we disaggregate that, the more it's hard to draw general conclusions from it. So we'd like to expand the index over time, but that also requires having more members of the RSPO who qualify and meet this criteria that we've set for the inclusion in the index.
That was going to be my next question. As exciting as this is, and you just admitted the sample size is small, it's just 18 companies. What needs to happen for your methodology to be applicable on a wider sort of scale? Yes, there's individual member criteria, such as where they're listed and so on, but can we apply this more widely? Was your research planning to do that?
We currently don't have plans to do that, but it certainly could be expanded. So there's the option to apply the same methodology to trading companies, for example, and to other commodities as well. So we can look to see if other certification bodies have the same premium for their membership. We expect that's not the case, given that the RSPO is the most advanced in any of the certification groups. However, I think it would be very interesting to see how this applies to other segments of the supply chain. We began with producers, given that we see the producers as needing the profitability most, because that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of implementing the changes in sustainability practices. But we hope that in the future to look at what that premium looks like for traders or refineries and other segments in the supply chain.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's now move on to our last presentation, for which I'd like to invite Matthew on the stage.
I'm going to try and use this one. Okay, thank you everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to take it into a slightly different direction. I'm really interested in whether the benefits that are accruing from RSPO membership are actually translating to people on the ground. And this is a case study across Indonesia. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that the big team that have contributed to this. The work's being led by Truly Santika, who's an absolutely amazing Indonesian statistician, but also with colleagues in Malaysia, Australia, and various countries throughout Europe. I'm going to present it in two parts. Firstly, we undertook a study of oil palm expansion and the effect that that's been having on rural welfare in Kalimantan. And that work is published in two papers that I'm happy to share with people today, later and possibly on Twitter. But the second part is looking at the RSPO standard, and that's across Indonesia, and that's not yet published, so that will be hopefully out soon. We're just undergoing review. And the last thing I should acknowledge is that we haven't received any funding directly from RSPO about this, so it's fully independent. Okay, so many of us in our team are focused on the environmental outcomes of land use change and other environmental changes in Borneo over the last 20 years. But we've become increasingly interested in the trade-offs this has with social development, particularly in Kalimantan. And if you look at these maps here, it's quite it's easy to see why. What we see in the last 15, 20 years is a major transition of people's livelihood sectors across Indonesian Borneo, moving from subsistence-based livelihoods focusing on forests, small-scale fisheries and small-scale farming, shown in green, over to more market-based or market-oriented livelihoods from the plantation sector over in orange. And this has happened very, very rapidly in Kalimantan. It's indicative of trends elsewhere, but it's particularly rapid in Kalimantan. And to date, we've been mostly interested in the environmental aspects of this change, but we've become increasingly more interested in the people side, and not least because the RSPO standard is also seeking to improve livelihoods and prospects for rural people in the areas where RSPO companies operate. And poverty, as we all know, is an implicit part of the Sustainable Development Goals, not least in SDG 1, which seeks to eradicate poverty in all of its forms. So what do we actually mean by poverty? Well, people tend to talk firstly about human well-being, and this is a state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy. And well-being really comes from a person's capability to function in society. And poverty arises when this capability or these capabilities break down. So poverty is much more than about having money, it's much more than having income, it's far beyond that. It can be manifested in hunger, malnutrition, limited access to healthcare or education. It could also be social discrimination and lack of ability to participate in decision making, for example. And this is recognised in the Sustainable Development Goals and anyone that uses them. So to get to the heart of what poverty is all about and how the RSPO standard has been influencing it, we really need to see poverty in a multidimensional way. So we use 18 indicators of poverty that reflect basic financial, physical, environmental and social aspects of human well-being, and they're spread pretty much evenly across the three facets of sustainability that the RSPO is based on. And we took these indicators from questions within Indonesia's national census, which is undertaken every 3 to 5 years in every single village unit across Indonesia. And we examined these questions, we tracked the same questions in a questionnaire across 6,500 villages in Kalimantan between 2000 and 2018, so across 6 different censi. And I'm not going to get deep into the methods, but we use a propensity score matching approach, which is a spatial matching technique, which examines what would have happened in the absence of oil palm. So it's a counterfactual analysis. We're essentially using a spatial algorithm to find equivalent-sized areas of oil palm or non-oil palm outside of the oil palm area, and that have got similar biophysical and landscape and livelihood conditions. So those are our controls. So the first part of that I'd like to share with you is actually contrary to the popular belief amongst industry and particularly the government of Indonesia, is that at least in Kalimantan, oil palm has not alleviated poverty. It's not led to an improving of living conditions in Kalimantan. So the graphs I'm showing you here are the indicators categorised across the basic physical, financial, social and environmental aspects of well-being. And you'll see a changing indicator over time on the x-axis. If you just look at the top tier of graphs, you're seeing that across basic physical, financial measures of well-being, this is just what happened in Kalimantan, regardless of oil palm. These all improved in the background, regardless of oil palm development. But the social and environmental aspects of well-being declined across Kalimantan. So these are the top level graphs here, and this is what happened in Borneo, regardless of oil palm. If you look at the bottom level, this is showing oil palm villages compared to those that didn't have oil palm. So if the bar is below the 0 line, it's a negative impact compared to the counterfactual, compared to control villages. And if it's above the line, it's positive. And so what you're seeing here is that the improvements to physical, basic and financial well-being that we were seeing collectively over Borneo across that 18-year study period were happening much slower in villages that had oil palm development. And the decline in social and environmental standards was much faster in areas that had oil palm. So central to understanding why this is the baseline livelihood conditions of the villages that were there before oil palm came in. And what we're seeing here, when we split the data according to those villages that were where subsistence-based livelihoods dominated compared to those that had market-based livelihoods, we're seeing that the negative impacts on basic physical and financial well-being were primarily coming from areas that were formerly dependent or recently highly dependent on subsistence-based livelihoods. But there were positive changes in those areas where there were market-oriented livelihoods. The problem is in Kalimantan is that most developments took place in areas where there were subsistence-based livelihoods. Unfortunately, the negative impacts on social and environmental well-being happened across the board. They were severe regardless of the livelihood system in the villages where the oil palm was grown. So naturally, we were interested to see whether the RSPO standard has been improving this overly negative situation in Kalimantan. So we used the maps of RSPO plantations, and we used non-RSPO maps and supplemented these with new data on the locations of smallholder and medium-sized producers across Kalimantan. We also expanded the analysis to 20,000 villages in Sumatra and around 4,800 villages in Papua. And with the additional small-scale producers digitized, we were adding another 52,000 square kilometers of oil palm onto the maps in Sumatra. So this is a significant undertaking. And so now we're looking at a three-way counterfactual. We're looking at what happened in oil palm villages compared to no oil palm, and then we're looking to see what happened once those villages became RSPO certified. What's important here is not just the land use transition, but it's also the transition of livelihoods that took place in that process. And that's because when you, in areas that were forested or recently deforested, the baseline livelihood condition is still very much subsistence-based. So in these areas of Borneo, Sumatra and Papua, people are still heavily dependent on small-scale farming, forest produce, as well as small-scale fisheries for their income. And then oil palm or other products come in. Whereas if you have this process going over a longer period of time, people tend to pick up more polycultural activities before they make the full switch over to large-scale agriculture. So it's important to recognise the transition of livelihoods as well as the transition of land use. And this is important because this baseline livelihood condition is quite different between Kalimantan, Sumatra and Papua. So in Kalimantan, we're seeing that most oil palm has been developed in villages that were based with subsistence-based livelihoods, and most RSPO certification, but not all of it, but most of it, has taken place in those areas. In Sumatra, the opposite is true. So actually most oil palm and most RSPO certification has taken place in villages that are already geared up for the market-oriented economy. And in Papua, it's kind of a halfway house. It's a little bit more closely aligned to what's happened in Sumatra. So now we're looking at the overall impact of RSPO, and this is the work that's not yet published, so please don't publicise it too far and wide. These are data combined over Kalimantan, Sumatra and Papua, so we're more interested in the livelihood systems than the actual islands themselves. And I'm showing you the indicators aggregated according to socioeconomic aspects of well-being versus socio-ecological aspects of well-being. It's just a little bit easier to visualize. We're splitting based on livelihood systems, so subsistence and market-based. And we're firstly on the left looking at the impacts of oil palm compared to no oil palm. And then on the right, we're looking at oil palm versus certified oil palm. And what you can see is similar findings to what I was demonstrating before, was that when you've got in subsistence-based areas, you're seeing an improvement in socioeconomic well-being across Kalimantan, Sumatra and Papua from the RSPO standard, but you're actually seeing a worsening of socio-ecological aspects of well-being. But if you look in the market-based livelihood areas, which were much more dominant in Sumatra, you are seeing that there are improvements with the RSPO standard to socio-economic well-being and a massive reversal of negative impacts into positive impacts of socio-ecological well-being. So the overall impact of RSPO in areas that are market-based, have market-based livelihoods, is very positive. So the RSPO impact critically depends on the underlying livelihood conditions in the villages. So I promise you this is the last set of graphs. And the reason I'm putting these here is to demonstrate that if we just looked at oil palm versus no oil palm versus RSPO oil palm, we're missing really critical information about what was happening in the villages before oil palm was established. So this is the baseline livelihood condition before oil palm even came in. So what we're doing is we're splitting the data to 8 years before oil palm came into the village. And then we're showing the time slice when oil palm was established, and then 8 years after certification. So we can't do this with all villages because not all RSPO plantations have been operational for that time, but we can do it for a substantial subset. And so what we're showing here, again, is an improvement of socioeconomic well-being in the subsistence-based areas, but we're also what you're seeing on the top left-hand graphs there is that you're starting from a much lower baseline in villages that are highly dependent on subsistence-based livelihoods, so -5 as an index of well-being. If you look down at the market-based livelihoods, and these are areas typical of Sumatra, but also parts of West Kalimantan and coastal Papua, you're seeing that the baseline condition is much higher than it is in areas with subsistence-based livelihoods. And you're seeing the reversal of negative impacts into positive impacts on the RSPO standard. The important thing to note here is that although the RSPO standard is massively improving the situation for people's poverty condition in villages where oil palm is established, it's still no better than what it was before oil palm came in. So there are 4 really key messages that we'd like to put forward from this research. The first is that RSPO has led to massive improvements to well-being, particularly in Sumatra, but it's particularly true for areas that are already set up for market-based agriculture. So it's a lot of Sumatra, but it's also parts of West Kalimantan as well. These areas are typically already deforested, have long been deforested, they're environmentally degraded, and they tend to be associated with market-based livelihood conditions. Although it should be noted that the conditions are still worse than when the baseline was in place before oil palm was established. The second take-home message is that RSPO appears to have been, or RSPO plantations appear to have been much less successful, much less effective in Kalimantan. And this is mainly seen in areas which are dominated by the subsistence-based livelihoods, which are disproportionately in the coastal lowlands in peatland areas. The third take-home message is that although it's a short time period that we're able to look at the data for Papua, it's still early days, but we are seeing the trajectories following what's happened in Sumatra. So we're seeing mostly benefits in rural communities where oil palm and RSPO certification is established in Papua. And the last take-home message is mostly for people that have undertaken these kinds of analyses, that it's really important to emphasise the baseline communities, the baseline conditions of the communities in which these counterfactual assessments are taking place. So it's really important to see what was happening before oil palm and indeed RSPO certification came on board. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank you very much for listening and take any questions.
Thanks very much, Matthew. That is a complex study, and I think it's going to take everybody, I think, a couple of readings of your slides to actually get all of the messages out. But the one thing that really I think I want to pick up on is the strong finding that you're getting that in areas where subsistence livelihoods are there and oil palm comes in, you're actually seeing something like RSPO leading to reduced socio-ecological impacts. Now that's interesting because one wouldn't expect that to happen, right? One would expect that that transition can be difficult, but something like certification should at least, improve it. So help us understand why we're seeing that result.
Okay, yeah, so I hinted at this in the last slide. It's mostly down to the fact that in Kalimantan, which is where most of these areas are, the oil palm in the last 18 years, and particularly the RSPO certification, has occurred in the coastal lowlands, and these are peatland areas, and that's where we're seeing the massive reductions in the indicators of socio-ecological well-being. So these indicators on the social side are reflecting social conflicts, they're reflecting exclusion from decision-making, and on the ecological side, they're reflecting water pollution and air pollution. And these are all associated with clearance and movement of people around peatland areas. The other important context for Kalimantan is that there's a lot of transmigration, or has been a lot of transmigration. And whereas in some parts of Indonesia that has been largely successful, in parts of Kalimantan, particularly in the peatland areas and the coastal lowlands, it's led to substantial social conflict. So oil palm companies are inheriting a lot of that conflict, and RSPO companies that have then subsequently sought certification, even where it may not be necessarily anything to do with their operations, they're also inheriting that conflict. And it will take some time for those any potential improvements to manifest in the data sets.
So really, when one is looking at issues as complex and multidimensional as poverty, it's no good to just focus on, certification of that one estate, but an appreciation of the wider social milieu, the background. I think the cultural context becomes, really important.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. The second question that I had for you before we take on some questions from the floor is, clearly, you've made this point repeatedly in your presentation, the baseline livelihood conditions of the communities, that matters tremendously as to whether they gain from oil palm at all, or whether they gain specifically from RSPO certification. For those of us sitting in the room here, what are some of the factors that can help make that transition less painful, or make that transition easier at all for communities which are switching from a subsistence-based livelihood approach to potentially palm or other cash crops?
I think the first thing to really emphasize is that you should expect improvements to take some time. We were actually somewhat surprised when we first started looking at these data that we could actually detect improvements or impacts within that time frame. But I think the fact is that certainly in parts of Sumatra, you're seeing that those improvements take place. So we know that it's possible. I guess the main focus should be on where plantations are developed and what kind of potential conflicts or social impacts are already present there in terms of what happened before the plantation came through. The indicators that we're using, particularly on the socio-economic side, are focused a lot on the provision of healthcare and education and access to finance. And those tend to be improving quite quickly. So there's obviously signs that that things are going well, and the direction of change is in the right direction. But it's the socio-ecological side that needs more attention.
Thanks, Matthew. So let's now start taking some questions, and there's a lot coming in, so please keep those questions coming. I'm going to try my best to get all of them across to our panel here. So the first one is a very typical question that's always asked in sessions like this on impact, attribution, and causality. And I've had questions from the floor to each one of you on that, but I'm going to try and summarize this. So 2 points. One is, in each of your analysis, how capable is your approach or method of actually disentangling attribution between RSPO and other factors? So in your case, Yannick, how is the LCA approach and methodology capable of saying that that reduction in GHG emission is singularly attributable to RSPO certification? And in your case, Sarah, how is your index saying that that improvement in equity performance of those companies is actually attributable to either RSPO membership or their oil palm work at all? Because there's probably other things that those companies do. So let's pick up on that attribution question.
Thank you. That was a good question. Then let's see if I can provide a good answer as well. We did 2 different things. First, we did a review of the principles and criteria to identify where would we expect to see differences in environmental performance. Then secondly, we did the data collection to see if we could confirm these differences. And then, yeah, that was kind of the first causality check we did. In the end, after we did the study, I did not show that in my presentation, but we have run a thorough quantitative uncertainty analysis to rule out any differences that is randomized by differences in data. So we have kind of ruled out these kind of random differences in the uncertainty analysis.
So we can be fairly sure that the results you're presenting are attributable to the RSPO certification. And
absolutely, yes.
That's encouraging. Sarah, in your case, it's a bit more complex because you're looking at financial performance of a company that could be doing loads of other things other than oil palm. So how do you respond to this question?
It's a great question because we haven't looked into that. We have not done the historical analysis to look at the causality question. I think what we can say is that we have picked companies based on their similarities in their structure. So we are filtering to ensure that palm oil is a major component of their operations, that they are of a certain size and a certain structure as a company. However, there's many other factors that influence their performance. But what we can see is that generally the companies that are RSPO members have sustainability commitments and investments internally in their organizations that suggest that the performance isn't only about palm oil sustainability, but their general commitment to sustainability, because they have the resourcing for staff, they have taken the commitment seriously internally. And so it does suggest that sustainability as a whole is driving their performance, and RSPO is a part of that, but likely it's tied to their sustainability commitments in other commodity sectors that they're involved in as well. But certainly further research would be needed to directly attribute the increase in their premiums to the RSPO membership.
Sure. Matthew, any thoughts from you on attribution causality? It's accounted for in your model at multiple levels, but...
Yeah, so there are 2 broad ways that you can do these kinds of assessments. And so ours has looked at a spatial counterfactual. The other is that you look at more detail about what's happening at household level at individual plantations. And there's a lot of information that you can get from that. The problem is that you can't scale it up to look at collectively over such a large area. And also, you can't really remove the selection, what we call selection bias. So people could be disproportionately selecting plantations and villages that are showcasing all the lovely, amazing things that the company is doing. But equally, they could be selecting all the really negative areas where there's lots of social conflict. And we see that in the reporting of impacts in the public domain. So the approach that we've taken is much more over a spatial, a large-scale analysis, and it's much coarser, but it's collectively looking at the impact or association over about 40,000 villages. So we're able to tell you, on average, across the whole area, what has happened. So we're very confident that we can attribute this to oil palm and to RSPO. What we can't do is tell you in detail what should be happening or what has happened at individual estates. That's really where more detailed household surveys can do. But we can point people to where problems have arisen, and then further sort of more detailed assessments could be done by a company or their associates near in those areas. So we can flag sort of we can flag areas that should be worthy of other additional attention.
Sure. Let's shift to another angle, which is coming up through a couple of questions from the floor, which is on the flip side of impacts, costs. And again, here there's questions around cost to all three of you. So let me try and sum this up. So I think specifically to Yannick, do LCA findings, are they also capable of assessing life cycle costing? That's a very specific question for you. And I think the question's motivated by the fact that the session is about using evidence to drive action. So for businesses who are interested in using LCA data and results, what insights can you share on costing? And then Sarah, in your case, likewise, to what extent does your model account for the price of certified oil palm? Is that one of the indicators you work with? And I think, Matthew, your insights on whether your approach looked at what it's costing smallholders or estates to actually come into certification as well.
Thank you for the question. The question was on life cycle costing and if the life cycle framework could be used for that. Definitely it can, and we have data so we could do that. However, I'm not sure it will give an answer to the question that is being asked here, because if you do life cycle costing, usually you would not look at private economic costs. It would be more like socioeconomic costs. So you would look at where will the value added end up, which people will end up having the value added being generated by the total price of the palm oil.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, thoughts from you?
So we do not consider the price of certified palm oil, but what we do consider, which is important, is the broader industry trend in performance. And what we can see is that none of the companies are protected from the upturns and downturns of the market. But what we see is that the RSPO companies have smaller downturns and bigger upturns as there is volatility in the market. So what it does suggest is certainly the price of palm oil is going to fluctuate and the price of certified palm oil is going to fluctuate. But as that happens, it's going to have bigger negative effects on the non-certified companies and bigger positive effects on the certified ones.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, any thoughts from you on whether your model accounts for cost? I mean, clearly it has links to socioeconomic performance and cost of inputs is always on the rise. Any insights from your work?
Yeah, I mean, our analysis is mostly showing a socioeconomic cost, but it's only capable enough of the data that's going into it. And those questions about costs, as in terms of investment, don't come into that sensor. So, in short, no.
Well, I think that's an interesting future area for research. I think across the entire sector on sustainability impacts, there is an increasing need to understand costs better. We're picking this up at ICL across work in multiple sectors. And I think more generally, there's a gap there. So maybe, that's something future research could look at. Back to you, Sarah. A couple of very interesting questions for you, but one which is provocative, which I think is well worth asking. Your data shows that when there was a major suspension from the RSPO, company premiums for existing RSPO members actually jumped up significantly. So does it mean that we need more suspensions for the premiums to go up?
I think in crude terms, yes. But what it actually suggests is that the enforcement of the RSPO standard and the principles and criteria is really important for that premium, because I think that as there's a lack of oversight or a concern over the lack of assurances in place, then the membership becomes less meaningful and is less tied to the financial premiums. So it is interesting to see that the suspension does have a jump, but I think that is really reflective of that it does reflect the existing procedures for dealing with violations and grievances and problems within the company's assurance systems.
So what we're after is not more suspensions, but belief in the effectiveness of the principles and criteria and the processes of RSPO being implemented.
Exactly, and I think the suspensions is an important nuance there, that the suspension alone actually isn't useful, because if the companies fall out of the RSPO, they become off the radar of this assurance system. So it's more about the communication of remediation and improvements in the company's assurance systems that helps to create the feedback over the strength of the RSPO system, rather than simply just pushing out companies that might have problems in their supply chains.
Sure. So Matthew, a couple of questions for you, and I think interestingly about the comparisons that your research is making between the impacts of certification in Sumatra and Kalimantan. So there's a question here: Sumatra developed oil palm much earlier than Kalimantan. Your research says that as well. Do you foresee Kalimantan moving in the Sumatra direction with regard to the impact? So is it a case of first things have to get worse before they get better?
That's one interpretation, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the important thing is that we don't know. But we would, based on the trajectory of what happened in Sumatra, and based on what's happening in subsistence-based areas in Sumatra, we would expect improvements to take time in Kalimantan, but to accrue. Where it possibly falls down, where it gets more complicated, is in peatland areas, because there's a very strong signal in these counterfactual analyses, not just on looking at oil palm versus with RSPO, but also we're using these analyses to look at performance of protected areas, performance of community forestry, and again and again and again, we're seeing problems associated with peatland areas and challenges in managing peatland, whether it's forested or non-forested, because of all the externalities from agriculture. So it remains to be seen, really, whether you would have longer term, how long it would take improvements to accrue. I guess another thing that's worth emphasising with that is that I think it's quite easy to look at that quite negatively, that perhaps companies should be avoiding certifying areas of peatland because it will take a while for those benefits to accrue. The flip side of that argument is that actually the improvements, whilst being more challenging, actually could make a much bigger difference there, because the counterfactual, of course, is that there's no RSPO there, and it's a really, really bad situation particularly in southern parts of central Kalimantan and Riau and Sumatra. So by actually having RSPO certification there, you are leading to an improvement, or you should be, hopefully over the long term.
Which I think points to also questions around ambitions of impact, right? One cannot expect to have the same degree of impact in socioeconomic setups, which are so different. And so one cannot equate the RSPO's performance in Sumatra readily to, its performance in Kalimantan, because that situations are so different. There's one here to both Matthew and Sarah, which I think links to the conversation we're having here around evidence, to the panel discussion yesterday on shared responsibility. And I think, Yannick, your view is also very welcome. So the question is the adoption of a shared responsibility thinking and philosophy among RSPO members specifically increasing the uptake of certified CPO, is that going to make a difference to socio-ecological and socio-economic outcomes? So are we going to get better at driving deeper impact if there's a shared responsibility approach?
Yes. You'd expect so. I mean, I guess the kinds of things that these analyses reveal is that you can have areas where you might have some very, very strong impact from an RSPO certified plantation, but if that plantation is surrounded by non-certified plantations that aren't as socially active as they could be, that's essentially driving down the living standards for communities in those areas. So once we have this when we achieve better shared responsibility, you would expect the positive impacts of certification to, or oil palm in general, to be seen. So that, yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I would agree with Matthew that we absolutely expect that the shared responsibility approach would increase the returns for producers in particular, because what we see is today the burden of sustainability is passed up the supply chain to producers who often are least well positioned to invest in sustainability. So the improved premium is coming from market incentives, from better investment in lending based on their practices. But if that investment in lending can come from downstream companies as well to support that sustainability behavior, we're going to see even higher premiums because there's multiple avenues of investment based on the sustainability performance. So I think it is a feedback loop and a way of having safeguards in place that it isn't just reliant on the financial community, but also on the supply chain actors to invest in the sustainability at the production level.
I absolutely agree that there are huge options and huge possibilities there. We are working with a company who have a product which is based on palm oil, and what their objective is that they want to offset their greenhouse gas impacts by, you have to pay an additional price of the product, but then they offset the impact by investing in nature conservation in Kalimantan and Sumatra. So there's really an option for rearranging who is paying for what, so that the entire burden is not only on the producers, but it can be shared all along the supply chain.
One question now which is resonating in some of the questions from the floor, but is one that strikes me very often. When you look at the impacts of a system such as RSPO that's focusing on improving economic, ecological, social, institutional aspects, in communities, there could often be trade-offs between impacts that you drive. So it could be that one set of actions that you're taking to drive better economic impacts as a sort of corollary does end up having negative ecological impacts. And we're seeing this in the case of certification in many places. Any thoughts on, do you see this in your research and results? Are there trade-offs between actually seeking to drive more economic impacts or ecological impacts? And do you have any recommendations on how I think more holistic interventions can be designed that don't result in some of these trade-offs?
Do you want me to go first?
Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So this is something that I'm actually really interested in. This is the direction I've moved in my scientific career, is much more about the trade-offs. So we've been looking at this in terms of community forestry in Indonesia, which actually is inextricably linked to oil palm development. And we see in community forestry that there are really distinct trade-offs between efforts to try to improve forest cover and then the social welfare of the people in there. So in only about 50% of cases you get this win-win solution, and the other 50% it's often negative or it's neutral. However, and we haven't yet examined this in oil palm, but I strongly think, based on the data, that we would get less of a trade-off. So actually, I would expect that these, particularly the zero deforestation commitments that have come through the RSPO in recent years, would actually lead to net positive socio-economic and socio-ecological impacts downstream for local communities, simply because of what we're seeing about this baseline livelihood condition. So one of the reasons why we might be seeing improvements quite quickly in Papua is that disproportionate area of the RSPO certification there has happened in areas that are already set up for market-based agriculture, and many of the companies that are involved have already put those zero deforestation commitments in place. Whereas, of course, in Kalimantan and Sumatra, a lot of the certification happened way before these commitments came on board. So I would actually expect that by really pushing forward on the zero deforestation commitments, you're actually also hopefully pulling up all the socio-ecological and socio-economic impacts of your operations as well. So I would try to tie the two together for a net positive rather than a trade-off.
Our research doesn't consider the social dimension, but I think it's a really important question. And there's a very large limitation in our research because we're choosing a methodology that only looks at publicly listed companies. So this is innately larger companies, at least $25 million in their market cap, that's large, it's huge. And I imagine if we were to look at the same types of premiums for private companies or for smaller companies, we're going to see that they're less. There's something about them being publicly listed that allows them to garner higher investments and returns. So I think it's a really important question that when you start looking at smaller companies, that that we keep an eye on if those premiums still exist, as well as looking across the board at the balance of those economic returns with social returns. But I think one of the important components of this as well is that the distribution of any premium is often weighted towards the downstream company. So where even there are price premiums in cocoa or coffee, we see that the majority of that price premium is captured downstream and not upstream. So I think as we continue to ask the question over how do we get premiums to producers, it's not a question of how do we get any premium, but making sure that premium is actually disproportionate among the production level and not being consumed and the benefits taken entirely by the retailers and consumer goods manufacturers.
Yannick, any thoughts from you on the trade-offs?
Yeah, just crudely speaking, if you look at the results presented by Sarah, where you see that there's an increased premium, so it indicates that there's not a very big backlash in terms of financial returns. And then also looking at the environmental impact, there's also an improvement for certified. So I think these, yeah, crudely speaking, it looks like overall on average, there's not a big trade-off. But of course, it requires that especially downstream uptake are willing to pay this additional price.
So winding up the session because we're nearly on time. So the session's titled Using Evidence to Inform Actions. So a quick 1 minute from each of you on what action or recommendations you would have for a system like RSPO from each of your pieces of research. So I know you all had your conclusions, but any specific 1 or 2 actions that you think are worth reiterating? Yannick, I'll start with you.
Can I have your question once again?
What actions would you recommend for a system like RSPO based on the findings from your research?
Yeah, actually I think I had already that in one of my slides. So instead of setting targets of how much oil palm and how many producers should be certified, I recommend the RSPO also to set targets on what is the impact. If the impact today is 3-point-something kilograms of CO2 per certified kilogram of oil, what should then the impact be in 1 year and in 5 years and in 10 years? And then they can start to intensify or put intensives for having more biogas capture, less peat, better water management to keep the greenhouse gas emissions going down.
Sarah?
I think my recommendation to the RSPO would be to ensure there are assurances in place. There are insurance processes that capture where there are violations and instill consequences for violations against the procedures. And I think the recommendation to the RSPO companies is to be very wary of the connections they have indirectly, in many cases, to companies that aren't sustainable, because I think increasingly there's going to be transparency around that, and there's going to be attention to how these RSPO companies are part of this complex web that links them to these impacts and is going to have financial consequences for them.
Matthew?
Yeah, I guess mine actually stems on from the question that was just asked, that I would really encourage people to be tying the social dimensions of and impacts of their work with these commitments for zero deforestation. And then for those companies that are already operational in formerly forested landscapes, particularly peatland, it's really important to set a baseline. So while our data shows these general trends across broad jurisdictional areas, it's quite important to set your own baseline there. So prior to establishing certification, it's really worth having a social impact study to set your baseline conditions, and then you can actually monitor your own impact locally at plantation level. And that goes really far beyond what we're able to do at your actual plantation unit. We can only show collectively over a larger area.
Thanks very much. So before we conclude the session, I just wanted to use the opportunity to make everyone aware of a new initiative called Evidencia. Evidencia is a new site that was launched earlier this year by ICL Rainforest Alliance and WWF. We've been talking about impacts at this session, and the site hopes to be a place that actually makes evidence available. So each of the studies that we've heard about here, we're soon going to have them hosted on the site. You'll find 50 plus impact studies already on the RSPO on the site. So an encouragement to all of you to please visit the site. It's new. We hope to improve it. Please engage with us, give us your feedback, and hopefully it's another tool that can help in this transition from using evidence to inform action and decisions. So just a note to all of you about Evidencia, please visit the site. And on that note, I think we're up with time. So please join me in thanking all of our 3 speakers today for a very insightful presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers and for the wonderful session. Ladies and gentlemen, before we go on a 30-minute break, a final reminder to the delegates who wish to register for the 16th General Assembly to kindly do so before 11 a.m. I'll kindly approach the registration counter for assistance. And, well, thank you. Do enjoy your coffee break. Some light refreshments have been lined up for you at the foyer. And please do return to the hall by 11 a.m. That's right. Enjoy your coffee, enjoy your refreshments, and please kindly return to the hall by 11 a.m. Thank you.